Thank you very much for joining us for today's webinar, the Cyber Executive Order, What You Need to Know in 30 Minutes. Next slide, please. My name is Stephen Lilly, and I'm joined today by my partners Veronica Glick and Howard Waltzman. We're going to focus on 3 topics today: what's in the executive order, why it matters for businesses, and what might be coming next from a policy perspective. We're keeping today's session short, so we'll be focusing on the high points in each of these areas. We'll try to reserve a few minutes at the end of the session to try to answer questions you have during our time today. So please feel free to submit those through the chat function of this WebEx. You may also be interested in our client alerts, which provides some more detail on various provisions of the executive order. I'd also invite you to reach out to any of us with whatever follow-up questions you may have. Next slide. The Cyber Executive Order arrives against the background of numerous high-profile hacking incidents that affected both government and private sector systems. These include the SolarWinds attack, the Microsoft Exchange server vulnerabilities, and the recent pipeline attack. The executive order reflects the Biden administration's belief that the federal government and the private sector need to enhance their security posture. And the executive order expressly says that incremental changes are not sufficient in the administration's view. Rather, the administration is focused on significantly strengthening the nation's cybersecurity, and quickly. So that leads to the first key takeaway from the executive order. It is ambitious in scope, and it is aggressive in the timelines it seeks to impose. Think of the Cyber EO as starting a federal sprint on cybersecurity that is intended to make material changes. Big picture, the Cyber EO takes 3 key steps to achieve these goals. First, it will impose new requirements on contractors that do business with the US government. In particular, there will be new information sharing requirements, as well as new requirements around secure development of software sold to the federal government. Second, it requires federal agencies to take a series of steps to strengthen their own cybersecurity posture. In particular, government agencies will be required to speed their moves to the cloud, move to zero trust architecture, and enhance cyber response capabilities. Third, it will create a cyber safety review board that will capture lessons learned from major cyber incidents. As noted here, it's also important that the Cyber EO focuses not only on traditional information technology, but also focuses on operational technology. That means that the government is focused on the cybersecurity of both databases, email systems, and other elements of enterprise systems, as well as the cybersecurity of industrial systems and infrastructure that it procures. So what does this mean for the private sector more broadly? The Cyber EO leverages the government's procurement power to accomplish many of its goals. As a result, companies that do business will feel the most direct impact of the Cyber EO. Companies that do business with the government will feel the most direct impact of the Cyber EO. Because it lacks the force of the statutes, the Cyber EO does not directly dictate changes in private sector behavior for businesses that are not contractors or suppliers to federal agencies. Still, the Cyber EO is intended to have as broad an effect on private sector cybersecurity as possible, even beyond companies that do business with the federal government. In particular, the Cyber EO is going to lead to the development of a series of new standards, including with respect to secure software development and information sharing, that are likely to inform expectations for companies across the economy more broadly. And that's the second key takeaway from the Cyber EO. All companies should pay attention to activities of the Cyber EO, even if they don't do business directly with the federal government. Of course, the Cyber EO isn't the end-all and be-all. It needs to be implemented by federal agencies, and it doesn't have the force of statute, as I mentioned. And that's the third key takeaway from the Cyber EO. There's more work to come that directly affects companies, both in terms of implementation and responses from policymakers. With that, let me turn it to Veronica to talk us through the Cyber EO's information sharing provisions. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Stephen. So the executive order states that information sharing has been limited by existing contractual language that restricts the way that private vendors of IT and OT systems can share information on threats or incidents with federal agencies, including the FBI and the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Administration. So the executive order addresses these perceived limitations in part by launching a process that will lead to new provisions in government contracts that will require companies to investigate, collect, and preserve data. So in other words, increased compliance obligations that will require some work to digest, translate to your company, and update relevant policies and procedures. The issues likely to come up as relevant companies handle incident response and vulnerability management in particular. So as companies start to obtain information about a potential incident or vulnerability, one issue will be how to handle the timing of government engagement. So in practice, there may be some gray areas as a company is learning about the incident or the vulnerability where it's unclear if the issue warrants information sharing. The executive order also tasks DHS and OMB with ensuring that service providers share cyber information broadly with the US government. In particular, the information and communications technology, ICT providers, will have the greatest burden in terms of timing of information sharing. So the reporting procedures are set to be developed within 90 days of the executive order, but the order states that ICT providers must promptly report incidents involving a software, product, or service. And the executive order specifically states that they have a maximum 3-day deadline for what the executive order calls the quote, most severe incidents. One additional overall point that's worth noting is that privacy obligations with respect to information sharing are not affected by the executive order. So the drafters clearly expect that increased sharing can occur while adhering to privacy laws, regulations, and policies. So one key takeaway here is that expanded information sharing will be expected of government contractors. And information sharing has clearly been a policy priority in the past, but it has not been mandatory before. So now it will be required of certain government contractors. And when it comes to information sharing with the government, companies face complicated legal and technical considerations that may not necessarily align with national security interests. So in general, the benefits of sharing information with the government include the ability to obtain information that's helpful to incident response efforts. The government may have a broader view of trends, for example. Increased security. Generally, sharing information contributes to a culture of companies being willing to share threats, which can lead to valuable information. And it also demonstrates goodwill. So that can also help overall demonstrate a proactive approach to addressing your cyber threats. But the risks of sharing are also notable, and those include potentially increased litigation risk, increased regulatory scrutiny. There's also technical considerations and care that has to be taken to avoid the risk of privilege waivers. And then just practically speaking, there's also the issue that doing so takes up valuable time and resources, often in the middle of incident response. So, and then beyond information sharing, this section of the executive order also sets out that agencies are required to take steps to standardize cybersecurity contractual requirements. So hopefully this will help establish some more consistent standards across agencies that'll be easier for companies to manage across a range of contracts that they may hold. So stepping back, if you are in-house counsel and here are some questions that we thought you might consider asking of your internal clients as we think about this executive order. The key question is really what changes can we anticipate, both in terms of our everyday policies and around information sharing, and more specifically, the company's approach to incident response or vulnerability management, and what steps would we need to take to prepare for those changes. Another important question is there particularly sensitive information that we would be concerned about sharing? So these are just a couple questions businesses that contract with the government should be asking internally. The executive order may also inform information sharing expectations for businesses that are not the focus of the executive order, which is federal contractors and suppliers. So really all businesses, as Stephen mentioned, may benefit from tracking guidance and expectations regarding what information to share and when, since those expectations may inform expectations of other regulatory agencies or standards asserted in future litigation. So for example, upcoming guidance may be helpful to inform companies with respect to how to manage time-consuming information sharing questions while resources are stretched during the response to a cyber incident. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Veronica. Secure software development is a key focus area of the Cyber EO. It reflects the administration's view, and I quote, that the development of commercial software often lacks transparency, sufficient focus on the ability of the software to resist attack, and adequate controls to prevent tampering by malicious actors, end quote. The Cyber EO directs agencies to undertake a series of actions to help achieve this goal. To hit some of the key points, under the Cyber EO, security standards for software development will be established by NIST as guidelines and then guidance. This will address such topics as secure software development environments, employing automated tools to check for vulnerabilities, providing a purchaser a software bill of materials or SBOM, participating in a vulnerability disclosure program, and ensuring the integrity and provenance of open source software. Critical software will be defined, identified by category, and subject to NIST guidance on security practices. OMB will require agencies to comply with both pieces of guidance discussed above, and which also will be required by contracts. Non-compliant software will not be considered for a broad range of federal contracts. OMB will have responsibility of implementing provisions related to legacy software, and NIST will issue guidelines recommending minimum standards for testing source code. So what does that mean for the private sector? First, we're looking at very rapid adoption of secure development practices. Compliance may be readily achievable for sophisticated companies that do business with the government, but challenging for many others, particularly if they don't have a head start working on these issues. Particular challenges may include creating an SBOM, which can raise both technical and administrative challenges, even for sophisticated businesses, creating secure software development environments, understanding the provenance of open source software, and meeting associated attestation requirements. There are also numerous open questions that could affect how these issues play out in practice. For example, the Cyber EO prioritizes the security of critical software, which the Cyber EO describes as software that performs functions critical to trust, such as affording or requiring elevated system privileges or direct access to networking and computing resources. However, this term has to be further defined. Depending on how that definition works out, it could be complex to apply in practice and may lead to difficult compliance issues, so that's definitely an issue to follow. And of course, the key question for many companies would be, how does it affect businesses that don't sell software to the government? Well, as a general matter, a huge percentage of software companies do business with the federal government, so these standards for secure software development are highly likely to become broadly applicable even beyond government contractors. For example, such standards for secure software development may be incorporated into technical standards, regulatory expectations, or standards of care assessed in litigation. In fact, this may be the broadest way in which the Cyber EO affects companies far removed from its direct scope. Next slide, please. Before turning this back to Veronica, I also want to highlight one other subsection of the Cyber EO that is focused on consumer labeling. The White House described this initiative as similar to the Energy Star label, with the intent to inform both the federal government and the public on whether the software was developed in compliance with security requirements. Specifically, the Cyber EO directs NIST to lead the creation of 2 pilot programs informed by existing consumer product label programs to educate the public on the security capabilities of IoT devices and software development practices. As it does so, NIST is required to consider ways to incentivize manufacturers and developers to participate in these programs. NIST will coordinate with the chair of the FTC on both consumer labeling programs. As you likely know from recent policy debates, the idea of cybersecurity labeling has been much discussed in recent years. There have been proposals to add a cyber label to cars, for example, and other products. The argument for such labels is they will create more informed consumers and allow them to leverage their buying power to encourage companies to better secure the products they sell. There has not been consensus on that theory, however. In particular, doubts have been raised about the utility of labeling programs relating to cybersecurity, given the challenge of creating objective assessments of a product's cybersecurity. Now we're going to see how such labeling programs work in practice, at least on a trial voluntary basis. Much still remains to be learned, but let me offer a couple of initial observations. First, the success and influence of the pilot labeling programs is likely to depend upon participation of manufacturers and developers, so outreach to the private sector is likely to be quite important in this area. Second, the involvement of the FTC raises questions about the perspective it will bring to the process and any follow-on actions it might take. While this program will be voluntary, it will be important to watch if and how the FTC, or potentially other agencies, seek to build on it going forward. And with that, let me turn it back to Veronica to discuss the Cyber Safety Review Board. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Stephen. So the Cyber Safety Review Board, established by the executive order, will review threat activity, vulnerabilities, mitigation activities, and agency responses after, quote, significant cyber incidents. So within 90 days, the Cyber Board will then provide recommendations to DHS for improving cybersecurity and incident response practices. The board is generally modeled after the National Transportation Safety Board, which is used after airplane crashes and other incidents, but it lacks its status and authority as an independent agency. So the order states that the board will have co-chairs, one from the government and one from the private sector. And appropriate private sector cybersecurity or software suppliers, as determined by DHS, will also participate in the Cyber Safety Review Board. So the Cyber Board will perform its first review based on recent cybersecurity incidents. And then in future, the review will be launched following an event triggering the establishment of a Cyber Unified Coordination Group, as directed by the National Security Advisor or as deemed necessary by DHS. In terms of the potential implications, it's likely that the board will serve as a prominent national voice on lessons learned after significant incidents. The board could recommend technical, administrative, or policy changes. Conclusions of the board may have negative implications for individuals or companies, and it's possible that conclusions may not be informed by a broad understanding of private sector perspectives. So as the board launches, some key questions have arisen, including the potential effectiveness of the Cyber Board, whether it will play an outsized role in establishing lessons learned, given its limitations on authority and perspective, and its ability to protect sensitive business information from public disclosure. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Veronica. I'm only going to touch very briefly on the Cyber EO's provisions that direct federal agencies to enhance their cybersecurity practices. To hit the highlights, the Cyber EO requires federal agencies to take a series of steps to modernize their cybersecurity posture, including through accelerating the move to cloud services and the adoption of zero trust architecture, as well as the deployment of EDR services to improve detection of vulnerabilities and incidents. The Cyber EO calls for the establishment of a standard response playbook across agencies, as well as the implementation of certain logging requirements. These requirements will not apply directly to private sector entities, so are less directly relevant to many businesses. So it is worth monitoring how these activities proceed to the extent possible. For example, the standardized playbook developed under the Cyber EO may inform future regulatory expectations of what private sector entities should cover in their own incident response playbooks. The standardized playbook also may be a potentially valuable reference point as companies evaluate their own incident response policies and procedures as part of their continuous improvement processes. So that completes our brief discussion of the high points of what's in the Cyber EO and what they mean for private sector entities. So now let me turn it over to Howard to cover what comes next. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Stephen. Companies will have a range of opportunities to weigh in on the implementation of the Cyber EO, which we expect to be implemented on a pretty aggressive timeline. These opportunities include public engagement by NIST, as well as public comment on contract language that will be proposed by the FAR Council. Now, as Stephen and Veronica both highlighted, the EO only goes as far as government contractors because the EO doesn't have the force of statute, and the hook for the EO only extends as far as really the federal government as a contracting entity goes. But we don't expect the EO to sort of stop at government contractors. We expect members of Congress who have been heavily involved in cybersecurity legislation to look at the EO for a model for all of industry. especially with respect to issues like information sharing, zero trust architecture, other cybersecurity standards. There are lots of ways, and companies need to pay close attention to how the EO evolves, how the application of the EO to contractors evolves, because that may have a direct impact on what is developed by NIST in terms of best practices for the whole industry, or what becomes considered reasonable business practices, because what the EO is going to do is the EO is going to set a new floor for government contractors, but that floor may very well become a floor for the entire private sector. Several of the members of Congress that have been very involved in potential legislation include Senator Warner, who's the chairman of the Senate Intel Committee. He's been working on a bipartisan basis with Senator Collins and Senator Cornyn and others on a cyber incident reporting bill that may mirror the timelines and triggers included in the EO. Also, Congressman Langevin has also been working on comparable legislation. But we don't expect legislation to stop at cyber incident reporting. We view whether it's a question of best practices or statutory requirements, members of Congress are very concerned about what they perceive of the level of cybersecurity adopted by lots of different parts of the private sector. And therefore, they're going to look to potentially require a baseline set of cybersecurity protections for all of industry. And with that, Veronica, are there any questions we've received from the audience?
Thanks, Howard. It looks like we have a few questions that relate to which government contractors the provisions that we've been discussing apply to. So maybe I'll turn to Stephen for some thoughts on that.
Yeah, we've got a couple of great questions, related questions on that topic, whether they apply to ICT government contractors or all government contractors, whether they'd apply really broadly to, companies that provide financial services to the government. These, great questions and ones that we've actually been working on with a range of clients already in response to the EO. I mean, the EO has a variety of different provisions, particularly with respect to information sharing, that on their face apply to different categories of providers. There are certain provisions there's one provision that applies primarily to IT and OT service providers. There's another provision that applies to ICT service providers. The challenge, however, is that there's a lot of room left for implementation for the implementing agencies to take the EO in a lot of different directions and either scope it very narrowly or scope it very broadly. So unfortunately, the answer right now is we don't really know. There's certain guidelines and sort of guardrails within the EO that give the direction, but the implementing agencies, I think, could take this in a lot of different directions. One of the questions that we've worked on with a range of clients, for example, is if you're making software, so this is shifting from the information sharing context into the sort of software development piece part of the EO, if you're making software that's included in a product that's provided to the government, does that fall within the software development provisions of the EO? And again, the EO isn't crystal clear on that question, and it leaves latitude to the agencies, the implementing agencies, to interpret the EO however they see fit, how they think appropriate, obviously consistent with the oversight they'll be given by the other parts of the administration. But these are really important questions that are going to be worked out in the coming months. I think, as Howard mentioned, there will be processes, whether it's the public engagement processes that NIST is running and that have already started, or further down the road, public comments, notice and comment on actual proposed updates to relevant contractual language, which will sort of happen, a little bit later. I think those will be really, really important questions for the private sector entities to weigh in on. What is the proper scope? of these requirements is certainly going to be a really important one. So it's a great question. Veronica, was there any other questions?
Thanks, Stephen. If we have a moment, another interesting question is how does this executive order respond to the recent incidents?
Sure. So, I think you can see in the executive order there are some, fairly direct lines between the SolarWinds incident in particular and what you see in the software development, secure development portions of the executive order. But at the same time, this obviously came out right after the Colonial Pipeline attack. So, people have sort of drawn lines between those two things. But I think big picture, there are, obviously this EO is informed by recent attacks and is trying to address recent attacks, but it is not by any means of a point-for-point response to a specific set of attacks. This is an attempt to change behavior, cybersecurity practices broadly within the government and with businesses that do companies that do business with the government. So it certainly addresses, the secure development issues and other types of challenges that, have been seen or believed to have contributed to recent incidents, but it goes much more broadly. So information sharing obviously is a big topic that people have been thinking about for a long time, making the shift from a generally voluntary process to now a sort of mandatory by contract approach is a big shift. Consumer labeling is a separate issue that I don't think really is related to any of the recent incidents. So to answer that, which is a great question, big picture, certainly, draws on and tries to respond to the recent incidents, but in no way is sort of a narrow attempt to respond to very specific concerns. It is definitely an effort to act more broadly and level up cybersecurity practices more generally. Great. Unless there are any more questions, maybe Howard, I should turn to you, Howard, to close this out.
Thanks, Stephen. And, thank you for everybody who participated today. We hope you've, learned what the kind of core parts of the EO are and what the potential is for the EO impacting not only federal contractors, but the entire private sector. We really do encourage you to keep apprised of what's going on with the EO. Because we do think it'll have sweeping implications down the road for really the entire private sector. Our information was on the first slide. Please feel free to reach out to any of us with any follow-up questions. And thanks again for joining us today.